He was out in his boat, alone. It was just as well, really. They were arguing so often these days. So much for late-in-life marriages being happier. Was it his fault? He had to admit that she could have a point. He was too old to be a thrill-seeker, and there had been enough excitement in his life by now. But damn it all, it was only a boat. It wasn't dangerous. Not after all the vehicles he tackled in his time. Still, he had won. She had bought him the boat. That blasted boat, she'd called it. Hardly the spirit of Christmas. Mind you, she'd kill him if she knew he was out in it already. It wasn't Christmas till tomorrow, and she'd never liked to open presents early. But she didn't have to know. He'd taken advantage of her last-minute shopping to sneak out for a while. A quick speed round the lake and back before she noticed there was something in the water. Some body in the water. He spun the wheel and aimed the boat to take him in closer for a better look. It may have been a bitter day, the bleak midwinter and all that, but thankfully the waters were calm and easy to steer through. It had been the stillness of the day that had encouraged him to go out in the boat in the first place. For once, it was relaxation, not excitement, he'd been after. Slowing the boat, he stretched over the side and grasped at her clothing. He pulled her aboard, her body light and unprotesting. She began to retch and cough. Thank God she was alive. It was cold enough on the boat, never mind in the water. "Grandfather!" She almost choked on the word. "Not quite, miss, though I'm certainly old enough." He stopped. His words were wasted. She was unconscious. He sighed. It was no good. He was going to have to tell Doris he'd opened his present a day early. General Alistair Lethbridge-Stewart, retired, reached for his mobile phone. Doris was clearly not happy. Having driven the girl back to the house and put her to bed, they were arguing about what to do next. "Alistair, we have to call the authorities. She needs an ambulance, and the police will want to find out how she's ended up there. She was in the middle of a lake. The middle. That's not somewhere one just ends up. Thank goodness you were there." "She seems to be just sleeping now. I'm sure she'll be fine." He took her hand. "You're not angry about me being out in the boat, then?" Her look told him any salvation was temporary, that they would discuss the matter later. "I'll phone for a man to come and look her over." "You will not! You will call the emergency services and let them deal with it like anyone else would. This is not another exciting adventure for UNIT. I can have someone here more quickly than an ambulance. I want to know more about this before we hand her over to just anyone." "Are you so desperate for this to be something to get involved in? It's a girl in a lake. She'll have thrown herself in. Boyfriend trouble. Nothing out of this world about that. Can't you see? It's small and miserable and human." She stroked his chin with one finger. "Alistair, you've retired. Again. You have to let all this go." She paused for breath, and the doorbell rang. Doris went to the door, and Alistair took the opportunity to reach for the phone. He'd never been one for blindly following orders. She might be right. UNIT would never normally be interested in a girl in a lake. But something seemed odd about it. He could feel it. And experience had taught him to always rely on his instincts. He was halfway through dialing the number when he heard a voice behind him. "I believe you have my granddaughter here." He turned to look at the old man silhouetted in the doorway. Check trousers, frock coat, white hair far too long for his age. Well, his apparent age, that was. He might look like he was pushing 70, but Alistair knew he could be anything up to 10 times that. This was no ordinary old man. It was him, but with a granddaughter. He put the phone down again. Doris was just behind the doctor, put out that he'd just barged past her, yet too polite to actually say so. She clearly didn't know who he was, and Alistair couldn't let on that he knew himself. "How did you know she was here?" Doris said. "Did someone in the village see us with her?" The doctor glanced back at her, and Alistair saw a familiar sly look play across unfamiliar features. Yes, that's quite right," the doctor agreed. "Someone in the village. But you do have her here. You can take me to Susan?" He was terrified, Alistair realised. In all the world-threatening situations they had faced together, he had never seen the doctor look so serious or so vulnerable, whichever face he'd been wearing. "Of course, she's just along here." Doris started towards the guest room where Susan was sleeping. "Do you know what happened to her, Mr.
Doctor? Just doctor will be fine, thank you."
He pushed past her into Susan's room, and the door closed curtly behind him. Doris was staring at Alistair. "Alistair?" He didn't answer. He was trying to hear what was going on through the door. The girl, Susan, was clearly awake. She seemed to be saying something about someone creeping up behind her, and then she started to cry. That clinched it. The two of them were definitely embroiled in something or other. "Alistair," Doris persisted. "Is that really him? The doctor?" He put one finger to his mouth, and she bit her lip. She caught on quick, did Doris, and knew when to keep quiet. "Yes, Doris, it's him." "Well, why didn't you say something then?" she whispered. "Why didn't he say something?"
"I don't know this one."
Alistair could feel the old fire stirring. If the doctor was here and he'd somehow let his granddaughter end up floating in a lake, well, even a former maths teacher could add up those beans. There had to be something going on, and something where they could clearly do with some help. "What do you mean you don't know this one?" He could see Doris was struggling. To be fair, she'd only met the doctor when there wasn't some ruckus on, when he'd had time to charm her. She'd had it easy, had never seen what the doctor could be like.
"We never met this one and me. He's from before my time."
"But you recognised him, didn't you?"
"Well, we nearly met on one occasion. We were at the same gathering, you could say, but we never really got the opportunity to say hello. Too many people. Too many doctors, in fact. And, for him, that might have been after this anyway." He shrugged. "I told you he was a complicated chap to know."
Doris shook her head. "Well, say hello now, Alistair. This is your oldest friend. You're not really going to ignore him, are you? He clearly needs help right now. It's what friends are for, isn't it?"
"We'll help however we can," he said. "But it's more complicated than that, Doris."
He wagged a finger at the closed door to the guest bedroom. "That man in there has drummed it into my head enough times that you don't tell anyone their future. Even him. Especially him. And he's the first one. My first one was the second one. You can see why that ties everything up in knots, can't you?" It didn't matter if she understood. She just had to have faith in him. He patted her hand.
"Best to leave him alone, just in case. Anyway, you're the one that wants me to take things easy, leave it all behind and move on.
Whatever they're up to, it's too dangerous for me to get involved in, isn't it?" He knew there'd be a condition, that Doris would only agree if he promised her something back. They got on because she knew exactly how to manage him, in the way Fiona never had. But suddenly, the door opened, and the doctor was smiling at them serenely. Alistair wondered how much of their conversation the old man had overheard.
"I'm sorry for any inconvenience my granddaughter and I may have caused you, especially at such an awkward time of year."
They were sat by the fire. Alistair was conscious of the photos framed on the mantelpiece. Himself as a young man in his prime, or stood with colleagues. One of them dressed in a velvet jacket rather than military uniform. One with a long scarf grinning and pretending to salute him. Suddenly, every photo seemed to have a doctor in it. Still, he hadn't appeared to have noticed. "How is she, Doctor?" Doris asked, coming in with a tea tray.
Good, good,"
said the doctor agreeably.
"She's stronger than you might think. Asleep now, of course. Best thing,"
said Alistair.
"Yes,"
said the doctor.
"It will speed the healing process."
He coughed and raised a handkerchief to his mouth.
"That is to say, a good night's sleep and she'll be as right as rain."
Doris passed the doctor his cup and gestured to the milk and sugar. "Well, you're both welcome to stay the night. I can go and air another room for you quite easily." Alistair looked up sharply, but Doris only smiled back at him. He realised the doctor was watching him too. He forced a smile.
"Quite right, Doris,"
he said as effusively as he could.
"Of course, you must both stay till she's well, Doctor. It's what Christmas is all about. Now, we're taking tea. You're in my house, and I haven't had the decency to introduce myself. This is Doris, and I'm Alistair Stewart."
Well, it was only a little white lie.
"You're both too kind, too kind. I shall forever be in your debt."
The doctor sipped at his tea. For a moment, Alistair thought he might even be chuckling. "It doesn't bear thinking about," said Doris, taking a seat beside her husband. "If Alistair hadn't been out in his boat and found her—" The doctor put his cup down carefully. His eyes were wide.
"Boat?"
he said.
"I thought you'd found her washed up on the shore. She was floating in the lake.
said Alistair.
I had to pull her aboard. I must have miscalculated,
said the doctor to himself. He seemed horrified by the very idea. Obviously he'd known Susan had been dumped in the lake, and Alistair was sure the doctor knew who had done it, but somehow the fact she hadn't been near the shore made it worse for him. Alistair leant forward.
I'm sure it wasn't your fault, he said. And she's safe now.
The doctor looked up at him.
What?
He said. The gleam came back into his eyes.
Oh, yes,
he said.
Yes, you're right.
He took another sip of tea.
So, tell me about this boat of yours.
I never wanted to buy him the thing in the first place, Doris admitted. But he's gone on and on about it for months, and to think if I hadn't...
said the doctor thoughtfully.
Alistair tried to keep the conversation flowing to stop the doctor from dwelling on what could have happened to Susan.
Doris feels I'm not handling retirement very well. Not enough adventure for an ex-military man.
He tailed off, realizing he was steering himself back into dangerous waters. Best to keep things abstract. His whole career had been spent keeping the most remarkable secrets. Why was it so difficult now?
I tell her I just like to keep busy. Activity keeps you from contemplating the past, you know. Yes,
said the doctor, staring into the depths of his teacup.
Yes, I know.
But it's not that, said Doris. I could cope with that. Her eyes were shining, the nearest she'd ever came to tears. He still wants to play the hero one final time, and I'm scared it will be final. Alistair, amazed, stared at her, but she wouldn't look at him. This was entirely unlike her. The doctor, however, was nodding.
Now you've retired again, there's no adventure anymore?
He seemed to be glad to keep talking.
At my, that is, our time of life, I've realized that one doesn't need to look for adventure. Adventure is everywhere. It'll find you out itself. Look at poor Susan,
he harumphed, wary of saying more about what had happened. They were all playing their cards close to their chests tonight. Doris still wouldn't look at him, but she took her husband's hand and held on tightly. This is what I've been telling him, she said. The army never seemed to leave him alone. He's something of a specialist. Alistair shot her a warning glare. To no avail. It was all coming out now. And he loves it. So why seek cheap thrills in a boat when the real thing comes his way every now and again? He'll never retire properly. And that's fine. Honestly, it is. I don't like it, but I can't cope with the worry. I know he makes a difference, for the better, and that's important. Now she looked at him, and her eyes were terrible to see. The sadness, the despair. He'd had no idea at all. But these dangerous, silly fads, she said. It's ridiculous. A speedboat, at our age. The doctor smiled at her reassuringly, but then turned to Alistair.
I thought you said you were an army man, not a naval one. That's why I bought it, Doctor. New challenges, new frontiers.
He couldn't resist the smile.
You don't concur? When it frightened your wife?
Alistair again gazed into her eyes. He'd had no idea she was so frightened of losing him. He'd known his unit life scared her. He just hadn't realized their life together did too. Why hadn't she just told him how she felt? But she had. Of course she had. Again and again, every time they argued. He just hadn't been listening.
It really does frighten you? He asked quietly.
Oh, it does. She looked quickly again at the doctor. He's over 70, and I'm not far behind. Despite himself, Alistair smiled at the coyness over her age. Our adventuring days are over, and I hate the water. I've told him I'm not getting on it, but he wouldn't stop pestering me about it. And it's Christmas, and I just caved in. The doctor said nothing, just regarded them. Alistair could suddenly believe he really was all those hundreds of years old. He shifted uneasily in his seat. Yes, this familiar, unquiet feeling. This was the doctor he knew.
Doctor?
He asked, knowing his old friend had something he wasn't saying. The doctor fixed him with a stare.
Sell it,
he said.
What? Or take it back. You don't need it.
He gestured at the photographs on the mantelpiece.
You have family. A grandson, it would seem. What are you getting at?
Alistair could feel himself getting angry, just like the old days, frustrated by the man's portents of doom, which, as ever, were never to be explained.
Just sell it.
The doctor was so firm, so challenging, that suddenly Alistair couldn't stand it any more.
I will not!
He was too old to be treated like this, and this doctor hadn't even met him yet. How dare he boss him about?
I will not be challenged in my own house.
He got to his feet, but the doctor remained sitting. Alistair loomed over him, struggling to find the words. He just felt awkward and silly, as ever. "Alistair!" Doris began. He waved her away.
I'm going for a walk.
He slammed the door on the way out, and regretted it instantly. The beautiful winter night was laid out before him. You couldn't be angry on such a night. Still, he was too proud to turn round this minute. The walk would do him good. Besides, he thought as he marched off down the lane, being rude to the doctor was certainly one way to stop the old man from thinking they'd ever be friends. "I'm sorry about that," said Doris. "I think he just hates being put out to pasture."
Age can be a terrible burden,
said the doctor. "You know, don't you?"
Whatever do you mean, Mrs. Stewart?
He looked her straight in the eye, but was still clearly trying to bluff her. Alistair must have learnt that trick from him, but Doris had learned to see through it. She kept her composure, wouldn't let him rile her like he had a husband. "You know what I mean. You know who he is." Her eyes dared him to deny it, and this time she won.
Oh, that. Yes, of course I do, Mrs. Lethbridge-Stewart. Your husband is my oldest, dearest friend. Do you really think it matters to someone like me if we haven't actually met yet?
He smiled gently at her, but there seemed to be something else. Was it relief? He seemed, she thought, so lonely. With his sort of lifestyle, friends, real friends, must be rare. He'd kept that hidden from her, the times they had met before, but recognizing it in him, she liked him all the more.
May I ask what gave me away?
Doris smiled back at him. "Susan. Our argument almost made you forget all about her, didn't it? For that to happen, you had to care about us just as much as you do about her." He laughed.
Susan will be just fine, Doris. If I may call you Doris. I knew that as soon as I saw her. My people are far more resilient and, well, I think we may have said too much already. We should probably be on our way before Alistair returns. It was really only my curiosity about the pair of you that stopped me waking her already. I'll take her back to our ship and then tie up our unfinished business on my own.
"You shouldn't be having adventures at your age either," she admonished.
No,
the doctor sighed.
But, like you say, they have a habit of finding us anyway.
For a moment a strange look came over him, like he'd given something away. In an instant it was gone.
Could I trouble you for a little more tea?
Doris ignored him. He'd given something away he hadn't meant to. Something about adventures coming unbidden, something connected to what they'd been talking about. Something about Alistair? "It's the boat, isn't it?" she said, surprising herself with the calm of her own voice.
Of course not,
said the doctor, a little too readily. "I thought you were worried about Susan. But if it wasn't her, it must be him. It's the boat that scares you. Something happens to him on the boat, doesn't it?" Her voice cracked as she spoke. The old man put his teacup and leant forward to her.
My dear, if he has told you anything about me, then you will know that I cannot tell you anything that is yet to happen.
A smile.
That's one of the few things my people and I do agree on.
Doris took a deep breath. She could feel the tears coming. "But you do know, don't you? What happens to him? How he dies?" The doctor smiled.
No,
he said.
Not yet. We've never met, remember? But when he goes, I'm there for him. At the funeral, I mean, I'm there. All of me, in fact. The ones that knew him best carry him. We don't usually get on, you know, but this time we make the effort. I think it works because we are all determined not to be the one to cause a fuss for him.
He suddenly laughed, delightedly.
Mind you,
he continued,
we weren't so successful at the wake. 2 of us ended up almost coming to blows. I think it started over who had had the last sausage roll, and suddenly they were fighting over which of them Alistair liked best.
Despite herself, Doris laughed through her tears. She'd only met a couple of them, but she could picture that so clearly. Then, suddenly, she stopped laughing. There was a pause as they looked at each other. "Am I there?" she asked. He just turned and looked at the fire. "I know, you can't tell me." It was as if he hadn't even heard her speak. He reached into his breast pocket and handed her his handkerchief.
I'm sorry, my dear. I didn't mean to make you cry.
As she dried her eyes, she said, "Doctor, when you go, will you take the boat? Whatever you're up to, would the boat help?" Even before he spoke, she could see in his face what the answer would be.
I cannot make your choices for you, he said. Even suggesting to you that there may be a choice to make is more than I should really do. Call it my gift to you both, that is. None of us know how much time we have, even my own people. We can be wrong. Things can change.
He got unsteadily to his feet. He tapped his hands against his pockets, as if checking for something he couldn't quite recall.
Now, if you'll excuse me, I must go and check on Susan.
Doris stayed where she was, curled up on the seat, his handkerchief in her hand. She was still there when Alistair came home, maybe an hour later. Neither of them was surprised to find the doctor and Susan gone. They didn't even have to mention it, nor did they mention the argument. Alistair simply sat down, took her hand in his, and they looked into the fire together. They were still there together when the embers died and Christmas came.